The gavel struck with finality, its sound reverberating through the hushed courtroom like a heartbeat. Judge Howard Thornton's steel-grey eyes fixed on the elderly woman standing before him, her shoulders slightly hunched, but her gaze unwavering. Ruth Miller, 73 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun secured by a faded blue ribbon, the same one her granddaughter had given her before disappearing from her life. Her weathered hands, marked by decades of honest work, trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the defendant's table. "Mrs. Miller," Judge Thornton began, his voice sharp as a blade cutting through the silence, "you are accused of trespassing on government property, obstruction, and unauthorized teaching of minors. Do you have anything to say in your defense before I deliver my ruling?" Scattered chuckles rippled through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's stern glance. Ruth's eyes reflected momentary confusion, legal terms that meant little to her. All she knew was that she had tried to help children who needed her, children abandoned in a neighborhood where the city had closed down the local school, children who appeared at her doorstep hungry, dirty, and silent. She had given them what little she could: food, old notebooks, stories about the universe, and yes, lessons. "Your Honor," Ruth's voice emerged as barely a whisper, "I didn't mean no harm. I was only trying to teach them, to help them feel like they matter in this world." Judge Thornton scoffed audibly, leaning forward with narrowed eyes. "You? Woman with no formal education, no teaching credentials. What gives you the right to teach anything to anyone?" His words struck her like physical blows, more painful than any sentence could be. "I cleaned office buildings for 42 years, Ruth replied, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I raised my son alone after my husband was killed in a construction accident. I may not have diplomas hanging on my wall, but I know what it means to learn from life itself." A murmur swept through the spectators, but Judge Thornton wasn't finished with his public admonishment. He glanced around theatrically and announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, we're witnessing the deterioration of societal order. People like Mrs. Miller, individuals with no qualifications, believe they can replace established institutions. She broke into public property and conducted unauthorized gatherings, all because she imagined herself qualified to teach." Someone in the back of the courtroom gasped. "Did you cry when you were caught, Mrs. Miller?" the judge mocked. "Do you feel ashamed now standing before this court?" Ruth's lips quivered, but her gaze remained steady. When she spoke, her voice cracked with emotion but carried clearly through the room. "I cried, yes, but not for myself. I cried when Tommy, the boy who'd been sleeping under the highway overpass, read a complete sentence aloud for the first time. I cried when Lily, who hadn't spoken a word in months after losing her mother, drew the sun with all its brilliant colors and said she wanted to become an artist someday. I cried because in their eyes, for once, I wasn't just an old lady. I was someone who mattered." Judge Thornton's face hardened, but something in the atmosphere of the courtroom had shifted. Even the court reporter had momentarily stopped typing. "You taught mathematics with chalk on crumbling walls, didn't you?" the prosecutor interjected with obvious disdain. "Where did someone like you even learn math?" "From my husband," Ruth answered softly. "He never attended college, but he used to solve equations with charcoal on our kitchen floor. He always told me that numbers were the only things in life that never lied to you." "And do you consider yourself some kind of unrecognized genius?" Judge Thornton fired back, his voice growing louder, pushing for a reaction that would justify his harshness. "I consider myself a survivor," she stated simply, "of poverty, of loneliness, of being told repeatedly that I was worth nothing." The courtroom fell silent again, this time with a different quality, a silence of recognition rather than judgment. Judge Thornton shuffled papers before him, uncomfortable with the shifting mood. The prosecutor cleared his throat, preparing to continue the questioning when a disruption occurred near the courtroom doors. A young man in a perfectly tailored suit entered, attracting everyone's attention. His confident stride and purposeful expression suggested he hadn't arrived by accident. "Permission to address the court, Your Honor," he called out, walking straight down the center aisle. Judge Thornton frowned deeply. "This is highly irregular. Identify yourself immediately." James Wilson, Your Honor, attorney with Wilson and Associates. He approached the bench with measured steps, and I'm here to provide relevant testimony regarding Mrs. Miller's case. On what grounds? The judge demanded, irritation evident in his tightening jaw. On the grounds that I was one of the children she taught, James replied, his voice carrying throughout the courtroom. Gasps and whispers erupted across the gallery. Ruth's eyes widened in disbelief. Jimmy? She whispered, peering more closely, at the distinguished man before her. Yes, Mrs. Miller, it's me. He smiled briefly at her before turning back to the judge. Your Honor, 20 years ago, I was a 10-year-old boy whose family had lost everything. We lived in our car for months. I was angry, falling behind in school, and heading toward juvenile detention before Mrs. Miller found me stealing food from her garden. Judge Thornton's expression remained skeptical, but he gestured for James to continue. Instead of calling the police, she invited me in for dinner. Then she invited my parents. She discovered I couldn't read properly and started teaching me. Not just reading, but how to believe in myself. Today, I have my own law practice and represent several major corporations. But will the judge believe this unexpected testimony or dismiss it as an emotional appeal? What other secrets might be revealed about Ruth's impact on her community? The judge's patience was visibly wearing thin. Mr. Wilson, while your personal testimony is touching, it doesn't excuse breaking the law. Mrs. Miller still trespassed on government property. That's why I've brought this, James replied, producing a thick folder from his briefcase. This contains affidavits from 23 adults, doctors, engineers, teachers, business owners, all of whom received their first real education from Ruth Miller. Many of us would have been lost without her intervention. The judge reluctantly accepted the folder, flipping through its contents with increasing discomfort. His steely composure began to crack as he read testimony after testimony. Furthermore, James continued, I've also brought documentation showing that the school building in question was officially abandoned by the city 3 years ago. The property was scheduled for demolition but never processed. Mrs. Miller didn't break into an active government facility. She repurposed a forgotten building that was gathering dust, while children in the neighborhood had nowhere to learn. Ruth stood quietly, overwhelmed by what was unfolding before her. She had never expected anyone to come to her defense, let alone someone whose life had turned out so successfully. Your Honor, the prosecutor interrupted, regardless of these testimonials, we must consider the precedent this sets. Citizens cannot simply appropriate public property for their personal projects, no matter how well-intentioned. Have you, or someone you know, ever had a person come into your life who believed in you, when no one else did? Drop your answer in the comments below. James nodded respectfully. I agree, Your Honor. That's why I've filed an application to officially repurpose the building as a community education center, with proper permits and qualified volunteers. Mrs. Miller has inspired an entire network of professionals willing to give back to the neighborhood that raised us. Judge Thornton's expression had gradually transformed from contempt to uncertainty. He studied Ruth more carefully now, seeing beyond the frail elderly woman to something he hadn't noticed before: dignity, resilience, and unwavering purpose. I have one more witness, if the court permits, James added. The judge sighed, but nodded his consent. Proceed. A middle-aged woman in medical scrubs entered the courtroom, her kind face lighting up at the sight of Ruth. Dr. Sarah Thompson, James introduced her, Chief of Pediatrics at Memorial Hospital. Sarah approached Ruth and took her hands. Mrs. Miller taught me science using rainwater and seeds when my family couldn't afford school supplies. Now I save children's lives every day. One by one, more people entered: a firefighter, a teacher, a social worker, each with their own story of how Ruth Miller had changed their trajectory. The courtroom, once filled with mockery, now hummed with something else entirely: respect. Judge Thornton removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. For the first time in his 30-year career, he found himself reconsidering not just the case before him, but his own approach to justice. Mrs. Miller, he finally said, his tone markedly different, it appears I may have been hasty in my assessment of your actions. Ruth smiled gently. "We all make mistakes, Your Honor. That's how we learn." Her simple wisdom struck him deeply. In all his years on the bench, had he forgotten the humanity behind the cases he judged? But who is Judge Thornton beyond his robes, and what personal demons drive his harsh judgments? What will he decide when faced with the undeniable evidence of Ruth's positive impact? The courtroom waited in tense silence as Judge Thornton deliberated. His expression had grown thoughtful, almost distant, as if he were seeing past the present moment into something only he could perceive. "Court will recess for 15 minutes, he announced abruptly, rising from his seat and disappearing into his chambers. Inside, he sank heavily into his chair, staring at the photographs on his desk, one of himself as a young man in law school, ambitious and idealistic, and another of his estranged daughter, whom he hadn't spoken to in years. He had always prided himself on upholding the letter of the law, on maintaining order in a chaotic world, but had his rigid adherence to rules blinded him to the spirit behind them? When he returned to the courtroom, something about his demeanor had shifted subtly. He surveyed the room, no longer filled with just another case, but with human lives interconnected in ways he'd failed to acknowledge. "I've reviewed the evidence and testimonies presented," he began formally. "And while I maintain that proper channels exist for a reason, I cannot ignore the extraordinary circumstances and outcomes demonstrated here today." He turned his attention directly to Ruth. "Mrs. Miller, your methods were unorthodox, but your results are undeniable. This court is about justice, and there would be no justice in punishing someone who has done so much good for their community." A collective exhalation of relief swept through the gallery. "Case dismissed," Judge Thornton declared, bringing down his gavel with finality. The courtroom erupted in applause and cheers. Ruth stood motionless, tears of relief and vindication streaming down her weathered cheeks. James embraced her, followed by Sarah and the others whose lives she had touched. But Judge Thornton wasn't finished. "Additionally," he continued, commanding, "Silence once more. I am recommending that the city expedite Mr. Wilson's application for the Community Education Center, and I'm personally volunteering my time to help navigate the legal requirements." Murmurs of surprise spread through the courtroom. The notorious Iron Judge was known for his harshness, not his community involvement. As people filed out, Judge Thornton approached Ruth privately. "Mrs. Miller, I owe you an apology. I allowed my preconceptions to cloud my judgment." Ruth studied him with kind eyes that seemed to see right through his judicial facade. "You know, Judge, it's never too late to learn a new lesson. I'm beginning to see that," he admitted, extending his hand. "Would you be willing to show me what you've been doing at that old school building?" 3 days later, Judge Howard Thornton stood in the doorway of the abandoned school, watching as Ruth moved between makeshift desks, helping children sound out words and work through simple arithmetic. The walls were adorned with colorful drawings, the windows cleaned to let in streams of sunlight. Despite the building's obvious disrepair, there was something undeniably magical about the space. Something alive with possibility. A young girl tugged at his suit jacket. "Are you here to learn too, mister?" The question, so innocent yet profound, caught him off guard. "Yes," he found himself answering truthfully. "I believe I am." Over the following weeks, the story of Ruth Miller and Judge Thornton spread throughout the city. What began as a courtroom confrontation evolved into something unprecedented, a partnership. The judge who had once sought to humiliate her now worked alongside her, leveraging his connections to secure proper funding, materials, and eventually official certification for what became known as Miller Community Learning Center. What other transformations await Judge Thornton as he steps outside his comfort zone? Will his relationship with his estranged daughter find healing through his newfound perspective? One crisp autumn morning, 6 months after the trial, Ruth arrived at the Learning Center to find Judge Thornton, Howard as she now called him, already there accompanied by a young woman in her 30s. "Ruth," he said, his voice unusually gentle, "I'd like you to meet my daughter, Elizabeth." Elizabeth's resemblance to her father was striking, though her expression held wariness rather than his newfound warmth. "Dad's told me about you," she said carefully. "About what you've built here and about how it's changed him." Ruth smiled. "Your father has been instrumental in making this place what it is now." Elizabeth looked skeptical. "My father? The man who missed my college graduation because a case ran long?" Howard winced visibly. "Lizzie, please." "It's all right," Ruth interjected softly. "People change when they're ready to, not when we want them to." She turned to Elizabeth. "Would you like to see what we're doing here?" That day marked another beginning. Elizabeth, a graphic designer, reluctantly agreed to help create materials for the children. Her visits became more frequent, and gradually, the tension between father and daughter began to thaw as they worked together on something larger than their past grievances. One evening, as they were leaving the center together, Elizabeth turned to her father. "You know, I hardly recognize you anymore." "In a good way." Howard nodded, emotion tightening his throat. "Ruth taught me something I should have learned long. How that rules without compassion aren't justice at all." The Community Learning Center flourished, becoming a model for similar programs throughout the city. What had begun in shame and accusation transformed into a beacon of hope for forgotten neighborhoods. Children who had previously fallen through the cracks found mentors, education, and most importantly, belief in their own potential. On the first anniversary of the center's official opening, a celebration brought together hundreds of community members. Ruth, now honored rather than scorned, stood before the crowd, her silver hair gleaming in the sunlight, the blue ribbon from her granddaughter still faithfully in place. "I never set out to change anything but the lives of a few children who needed help," she said softly into the microphone. "I certainly never expected to end up in court." Gentle laughter rippled through the audience. But sometimes what looks like an ending is actually the beginning of something far more beautiful than we could have imagined. Howard Thornton, standing nearby, nodded in profound agreement. The man who had once sought to make an example of Ruth Miller had himself become an example of humility, of growth, of the power of second chances. As Ruth concluded her speech, a young woman made her way through the crowd, her eyes fixed on the elderly teacher. When Ruth saw her, she froze, her hand flying to her mouth. "Grandma?" the woman called out, tears streaming down her face. "Marie?" Ruth whispered, hardly daring to believe. "Is it really you?" The granddaughter she hadn't seen in 15 years rushed forward, enveloping Ruth in an embrace that seemed to heal a lifetime of separation in an instant. "I saw you on the news," Marie explained through tears. "The story about your case, about everything you've done. I've been trying to find you for so long." Ruth held her granddaughter tightly, the blue ribbon that had kept her memory alive now a bridge between past and present. Howard watched from a respectful distance, his own daughter at his side, understanding deeply that the true measure of justice wasn't found in courtrooms, but in restored relationships and healed hearts. Later that evening, as the celebration continued around them, Ruth and Howard sat quietly on a bench outside the learning center. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "when you were trying to humiliate me in that courtroom, I never imagined we'd end up here." Howard chuckled softly. "Neither did I. I spent 30 years believing justice was about punishment. You taught me it's really about restoration." Ruth patted his hand gently. "We're all teachers and students throughout our lives, Howard. The trouble begins when we forget which role we're playing." The sun set over the community they had helped rebuild together. The stern judge and the elderly teacher, an unlikely alliance that had rippled outward to touch countless lives. Where there had once been abandonment and neglect, now stood possibility and promise. Where there had been judgment, now flourished understanding. And as darkness fell, the lights of the learning center glowed warmly, a beacon signaling that sometimes the most powerful transformations begin in the most unexpected places, even in a courtroom where an elderly woman refused to be shamed for doing what was right. Congratulations, type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.